Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and you are on the Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about why driving and being in a car is such a problem for people with neural circuit dizziness. We're going to cover the different types of patterns that tend to show up around driving. We're going to talk about why those patterns happen, and then we're going to cover some things that you can do to help restore your ability to be in a car. So first, let's talk about the patterns that occur surrounding driving and being in a car. So with neural circuit dizziness, there are 3 patterns that show up. And I've mentioned this before, but regardless of the diagnosis you have, whether it's PPPD, MdDS, vestibular migraine, or something else, these 3 patterns can occur in any of those diagnoses. The first pattern is the most classic pattern, and that is that your symptoms get worse when you're in a moving vehicle. The second pattern is that your symptoms stay the same or aren't changed a whole lot by being in a moving vehicle. And the third pattern is that your symptoms get better when you're in a moving vehicle. Again, there are all sorts of sub-variations of each of those 3 categories. These vary a lot from person to person. And again, as I said, these vary a lot even within specific diagnoses. Now, the most important thing to understand is that in all 3 of these cases, we're dealing with something called a brain prediction error. And this is something I've spoken about in previous videos. But to remind you, the brain doesn't just react to the things that are happening around us. The brain actually actively predicts what's going to happen, and then it compares the information it's getting from your senses to its predictions to determine what's actually happening. Also, to remind you, your balance system uses 3 different senses: your eyes, ears, and sense of touch. So in other words, in each type of situation, whether you're still or you're walking or you're driving or any other activity, your brain uses different sets of expectations for each of these activities. I'm going to call them templates. In each template, then, your brain is expecting different kinds of information to come in from your eyes, ears, and sense of touch. The problem with neural circuit dizziness, which, as I said, includes the diagnoses I specified earlier and others, is that the brain is not switching templates correctly based on the situation that you're in. So if you have motion-provoked symptoms, meaning when you move, your symptoms get worse, your brain is not predicting movement correctly. It's using a still template. Likewise, if your symptoms get better when you're moving, but they get worse when you're still, your brain is using a moving template, and it's not switching to a still template when you're still. Again, these are just examples because, as many of you know, most of you have variations from situation to situation. So in some situations, your brain may be using the correct template, but in others, your brain may not be using the correct template, and then you have symptoms. So let's talk about this car template, this being in a moving vehicle template, and what it should look like. So in a moving vehicle, what's happening is you're getting contradictory information from your 3 senses. In some situations, your balance system is getting matching information from all 3 senses. Your eyes are telling you that you're moving, your sense of touch is telling you that you're moving, and your vestibular organs in your inner ear are telling you that you're moving. Now, this doesn't mean that you might not find yourself dizzy when your senses match, but in a car, things can get a little tricky because the senses don't match. In a car, your eyes are telling you that you're moving. Your sense of touch is a little bit vague because you're getting the rumbles, you're getting a little bit of moving back and forth, but that's not necessarily giving your brain the kinds of messages it would be getting if you were moving your own body. We have all sorts of sensors in our joints and our muscles and our skin that tell our brain that we're moving ourselves, and those are not getting stimulated while you're driving. So your sense of touch is not giving your brain the same kind of clear information when you're driving. But the one that's really tricky is your inner ears. So as we've talked about in previous videos, your inner ears sense movement. Inside the tiny organs inside your inner ear, there is fluid, and when the fluid inside your ear moves, your brain knows that you're moving. However, what I'm actually saying here is that your organs inside your inner ear are really good at detecting acceleration. In other words, they're really good at detecting changes to your speed, but not telling you what speed you're moving at when you're at a constant speed. So when you're in a car and you're stopping and going all the time, your vestibular system, your inner ears, that's getting a lot of stimulation. But when you're driving at a relatively constant speed and there are no stops and goes and there's no acceleration and deceleration, your vestibular system is getting conflicting information yet again because your ears don't exactly know what to make of that situation. Again, in our natural state, when we're moving ourselves, there's always enough variation in our pace for our ears to understand that we're moving. But when we're in a car, they might not understand that we're moving. Now, all those things together, the fact that the ears are getting kind of weird, inconsistent information. The sense of touch is getting weird, inconsistent information. And then the eyes are getting this strong message that you're actually moving, creates a situation that's very confusing potentially for a brain that's not doing a great job of integrating or putting together information from all three of those senses. So if your brain is using a template, like we talked about, that prefers stillness. It's used to being still, it's expecting you to be still, or it's, in other words, particularly sensitive to movement. It could potentially be even more confused, even more sensitive to changes when there are inconsistent signals, when there are differences in the information that's coming in from those three senses. This explains why so many people with neural circuit dizziness have trouble in moving vehicles. And this is why, for this particular pattern, vestibular rehabilitation therapy can help. Because the purpose of vestibular rehab is to help your brain learn to put together the information from your eyes, ears, and sense of touch. When your brain is doing a better job at that, it's more likely to correctly interpret that strange or contradictory information that you're getting when you're driving or in a car. That being said, we still have a situation now where we're not really explaining the other patterns, and we're not really explaining those of you who've been doing vestibular therapy or have gone through a lot of vestibular therapy and are still having difficulties driving or being in a car. So we're going to address those now. With pattern number 2, in which you're experiencing symptoms all the time, whether you're still or you're in a moving vehicle, this is an extreme situation where your brain is basically in danger mode all the time. Your brain interprets any information coming in to your vestibular system as dangerous. And in that case, again, although vestibular therapy really is supposed to address this integration problem or this problem of putting together information, it can also help because it can help reduce your brain's sense of fear over the symptoms and over the stimulation that it's getting from your senses. But pattern number 3, which is typical for some disorders and not for others, but again can occur in any of them, that's the one in which you feel better when driving or being in a vehicle. And the way that scientists typically explain this is by describing what they call a velocity storage system, which basically means a brain prediction. A velocity storage system just means that your brain is using prior experience with motion to predict future motion. In other words, in scenario number 3, your brain is predicting movement even when there isn't any. When you're moving, the template that your brain is using matches reality, so you don't have symptoms. But when you're still, if your brain is still using that template, you feel symptoms. And this is also why, unfortunately, typical vestibular rehab doesn't help with that particular pattern of symptoms, because stimulating your vestibular system with driving isn't going to help your system learn that it's okay to be still and that it should switch to a different template. Although there are some vestibular rehabilitation programs that progress you from being moving to being still, and those can help. All that being said, let's seg into what I do to help people who are stuck in a situation where vestibular rehab hasn't really helped them, and they're still dealing with these really difficult symptoms while driving or being in a car. The most important thing that I do for those folks is to help reduce their fear and to normalize and explain what's happening. As we've talked about in previous videos, and I'm gonna link to one above and in the video description below that's a good overview, neural circuit dizziness is essentially driven by a brain with an out of control danger mode. And if we can reduce danger mode, if we can tell the brain that you're actually safe, that there's nothing to fear, that the symptoms are not a dangerous sensation, many times that's all that it takes to reduce the symptoms. And you'll be able to see this elsewhere on my channel. Under many of the videos, you'll see comments talking about this. That said, for some of you, this may warrant further investigation. And my first question for you is, did your symptoms start with some kind of incident while driving, like a car accident? What is your history with driving? If your symptoms didn't start with a car accident, but you had fear of driving beforehand, this still applies. If your brain has a particular fear reaction or danger mode to driving, it would make complete sense why it would turn on your dizzy circuit while you're driving. This just reflects the fact that your brain doesn't feel safe driving. And that makes complete sense if you had a car accident or some other kind of incident while driving. For this, in my experience, what's needed most is to demystify why this is happening. Most people who have dizziness after a car accident are told it's because they have some kind of invisible damage to their bodies and they're never going to be the same. And that again is a message of danger that is much more likely to increase symptoms than it is to help someone. So understanding that this is a perfectly natural, normal response. If your brain is in danger mode, it's going to activate your danger circuits, whatever they are. Just recognizing that fact can help people get better. This also just takes some patience and acknowledgement of the feelings and difficulties you've had as the result of the tough experiences related to driving. So for those of you who've had those experiences, but also for those of you who haven't, I encourage everyone who's having difficulties with driving right now, who has not gotten better with vestibular rehab, who's dealing with a lot of stress and fear about driving, I would like you to take a moment right now to close your eyes if you're comfortable, look inside yourself and ask yourself, what feelings and thoughts come up about driving when you're imagining it here in this safe place? Are those thoughts and feelings familiar to you from any other part of your life? What I often find is that people have a very active fear response to driving when it's connected somehow to something else that that person has gone through that was really difficult. Now, I'm not downplaying how scary it is to drive when you have a vestibular condition, not at all. But if you're here watching this video, chances are that it's more than just a little bit of fear, a little bit of understandable concern based on the experiences that you've had before. There's something really, really, really scary coming up about this for you, and it's worth us understanding why. So I'm going to give some examples now of things that I've seen come up in clients about or in relation to driving that again, ended up being connected to the driving, but didn't start with the driving. And those are things that we want to address. A common one is that need to be in control and feeling like we're not in control. These folks sometimes feel better when driving than when the passenger, or vice versa. It can go both ways. These feelings can come up very naturally for any person, but they often stem from difficulties earlier on in our lives, or particularly difficult or even traumatic situations where we were not in control, where someone else had control over us. And it created, again, this very strong fear response, this very strong avoidance of that feeling of not being in control. A second one that's very much related is that feeling of being trapped. So when I investigate this concern about driving with my clients, often when we dig down, it's that there's a part of them that feels really, really worried about this possibility of being trapped in a situation where they're panicking and they can't get out, they can't escape. And while, again, this is an enormously human experience and makes a lot of sense, when people have that very, very, very strong fear of getting trapped, often it relates to times earlier in their lives when they were trapped, when they couldn't get out of a bad situation. Another one that comes up is feeling like you're not capable of handling it if something happens, something difficult or something bad. Again, this also often goes back to experiences earlier in our lives when we felt helpless or hopeless, like we weren't capable of handling things that were coming at us, which was certainly true for many of us earlier on in our lives, especially in childhood. While again, it makes complete sense and would be a completely human reaction to have that sense of not being capable when you've had an awful vestibular event, what I find is people who have that very strong response to this particular feeling, it's not new. It's not coming from the vestibular condition. It's being brought up by it and made worse by it. And finally, what comes up sometimes are difficult memories specifically related to the car or being in a passive motion situation. I've seen people have recollections of having a really difficult fight or a traumatic situation happen near a moving vehicle or in a moving vehicle, and then the brain starts to connect those things to danger mode. I've seen people talk about parents being truck drivers or being involved in transportation in some way and feeling abandoned as a child or feeling afraid for that parent as a child. Again, all these things that I just listed, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, these are all normal human reactions to having terrible symptoms and being very afraid for very good reason. But when we have that very strong danger response, my question is always, what background is leading your brain to have this very strong danger response? And I'm saying this from an educated perspective, not just based on what I've seen with clients, but also the fact that one of the biggest predictors of whether someone has post-traumatic stress symptoms from a really difficult event is whether that person has already had difficult experiences or traumatic events. So again, if you're having a very strong reaction to driving, often it's because of previous experiences plus the vestibular experiences you're having now. So why dig into these experiences? It's not necessarily to resolve all the terrible things that have ever happened to you. It's to reduce danger mode. So all this to say, of course, that again, your reactions are completely understandable to your symptoms right now, but our job is to look at the roots of those reactions to try to reduce that automatic fear response as much as we can so that your brain stops flagging every single one of these situations as dangerous. And again, the objective there is once your brain stops doing that, it's going to be willing to switch templates. It's going to be willing to switch from one mode to another, make good predictions, and resolve your symptoms. So I hope this was enlightening for you guys and helpful in some way. I look forward to your questions and comments. You can leave them below. And as always, if you found this helpful, please like, share, subscribe to my channel. And again, guys, thank you for tuning in. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.